it's the Scene World Podcast. I am AJ. He is Jurg over there.
Yeah.
And this is the Scene World Podcast. I think I said that. Over to you, my man.
Well, today we are talking to Joe Barron from Slightly Made Studios. He is marketing and eSports manager, and he was also responsible for Project Cars 3 that was published by Namco Bandai recently this year.
Okay.
And we talk about it, about the whole series of Project Cars, and especially why the game changed from being a pure simulator to a more arcadic race experience.
Well, do we have any news?
Sure.
I've just got one here. Just that OSMO, which is it's a code interpreter that lets you play the old Infocom, text adventure games. They now have a C128 and +4 version that has just been released. So that's cool. There's a link to. We'll put a link to where you can get that and check it out and play it on your +4 or 128 or Advice if that's your particular thing. And that's all I got.
Okay. Well, I got a couple of news.
Okay.
Number one is a sad news. Silvio Severino, aka the Overkiller, sent an email to Hokuto Force, and I forwarded it to the Scene World staff. He decided to leave Hokuto Force, Scene World magazine. He wrote it's too stressful in his real life activities and having issues with stress in the demo scene.
Right.
And he feels like this is nothing for him anymore, which is kind of sad for me, but of course I consider him a good friend.
Yeah.
He was one of the co-founders of the Scene World magazine 20 years ago.
Yeah, well, he's still a good friend. He's still, he may be out of the scene, but we're still certainly not going to cut off our ties with him.
I hope. I mean, that's also up to him. I mean,
I think it was a lot of stress from external forces, because he said it was nothing to do with Scene World, nothing to do with Hokuto Force specifically. It was just a lot of other external things that he didn't need to deal with, which I understand. You get older, there's the last thing you need to be dealing with is jackasses in your hobby. That are making it a pain in the ass.
But I mean, we had those situations in Scene World, especially in the early days too. The haters and stuff, and we also wouldn't quit the scene because of it.
Yeah. So. Well, sometimes you make a value call for what's more important in your life, and that's the call he made, and I'll stand by him, and he's still my buddy, even though he's not involved in this anymore. That's I have friends outside of the scene.
So Silvio, let's stay in touch.
Yes, we love you. And you're staying on my Facebook friends list.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay, other news I got from Richard Bayliss, who's also working for Scene World, and he said, with thanks to Arla Games for his help, a lot of my creations and collaboration projects are now playable on the site in a web browser. I will be adding a few more of my quiet favorites on my itch.io profile later this week, hopefully for Christmas.
Cool.
The only games that are not available yet are Killer Saucers and Zappet in the Butt DX.
What? Oh, zap it in the butt. Zap it in the butt.
I have no idea.
Yeah,
These are going to be released on Christmas Day. The site is richard-tnd.itch.io.
Which we will put right down there so that you can see it and all that jazz.
Yeah. There are a few more games planned for 2021, including Cruiser X79.
That dude is just a beast. He just blasts through games like nothing.
I know. And she's doing the assembler course for Scene World. Thanks for that, Richard.
Yes.
Okay, other news is, as I assumed in the last podcast news section, Papillon has been released.
Oh, really?
And it has been shipped last Monday, and it was supposed to be here on Thursday.
Okay.
But due to Christmas, Christmas load in the postal service, a GLS pushed it to another date, and now it's coming out. It's going to be delivered to me on the 22nd, they say.
Nevertheless, it's still coming.
On the day or the day before you hear this.
Yeah.
And but there are videos, and it's awesome. It's awesome.
All right. Cool.
Awesome. It's the best graphically and sound-wise, and even game-wise. It seems to make fun. Since it's the most advanced game ever released on the Mega Drive, and that is because it's using a Datenmeister sound chip.
Okay.
And it's using a coprocessor, and it's having 80 megabytes. So it's the biggest Mega Drive / Genesis game ever released. I mean, Watermelon Games did Pier Solar 10 years ago, and that was 64 megabytes, and that was already the biggest, and now they have 80.
Okay.
And in this video I will show you. This guy even opened the cartridge to prove there are those custom shifts in it.
Okay.
So
cool.
You really get what you paid for.
Nice.
It's amazing. And now they already announced a new game, but there are no details in it. Except it's a brawler, exclusive, it supports 2-player games, it has a dolphin in it.
Echo?
Yeah, I thought about that too. Yeah. And they have a little echo on this 3 question mark page.
Yeah.
But it doesn't sound like echo.
Huh.
The game title is AMB96. And in the pauses, you can enter the letter you guessed could be in there. But the short form of the title is AMB96.
Okay. Huh?
Yeah. Yep.
Cool.
So
cool. We'll put links to everything where people can find them.
Yeah, he has hidden that pretty well.
Yes.
Another thing is, what shocked most people is that the cheapest version of the game Papillon is now not costing $69, but $129. And that is because he wrote, that is because PayPal, that is because PayPal froze his money 3 years ago because, of this dodgy kind of behavior. And now he said he shipped out and paid for the production of the pre-orders all from his own pockets. And now the new people ordering the games have to make up and fill the gap.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Right.
Well, either way.
Is it worth $129?
You'll have to let us know.
Sure. I'm not sure, but I'm happy that I didn't cancel my pre-order.
Yeah, you're gonna find out.
And waited almost for 4 years.
Yeah.
And only paid $69.
Yeah.
And if you were one of the Founder Edition orders from August 2013, you even paid only $59.
Okay, nice.
But I ordered in April 2017 when they had this pre-order phase.
Right.
On their Watermelon Game Factory page.
Yeah.
Yeah. So against all the odds and vaporware accusations and stuff, he really pushed it out before Christmas, and it seems like everybody will get it before Christmas because the American sellers or buyers, because those were shipped from America.
Yep.
But my version is coming from France, and that will take a while to arrive.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. Well,
cool. Oh,
that's it.
All right, if that's it, then we should go talk to Joe, who is right over there in sometime probably in days before the end of the world.
Perfect.
Let's go hit him up.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Womp, womp, womp.
Today, we are talking to Joe Barron, marketing and esports manager from Slightly Mad Studios. And today we will be talking about Project Cars 3. Hello, Joe. Nice to meet you.
Yeah,
welcome
nice
to the
meet
podcast.
I'm glad as you mentioned before we started recording, we've been trying to do this interview for nearly 3 years, so it's good to finally get there.
Perfect, yeah. Even if it's for the successor game and not for Project Cars 2 that we originally planned for. And, usually we ask our guests how you actually started being into computers and into the video game industry.
It's a long-winded story for me, so I'll try and do the short version of it. But
sure.
I've been into games since I was a kid. My dad tried not to let us get into games, but he got into games basically because he used to play Sega arcade games on business trips, and then he bought a Mega Drive once the home version of Super Hang-On came out, because he used to race motorbikes when he was younger. And then one night he fell asleep while he was playing it, and then as kids we came downstairs the next morning and found this strange machine in the living room, and ever since then it's been impossible to get away from it. And then as far as actually working in the industry, so some friends and I met through the GameSpot community in the early part of the 2000s, probably 2005-ish, something like that. And we got inspired and started our own website and doing reviews and podcasts and stuff like that. And then I was a freelance writer in the press for a while. I did some stuff for GameSpot and for IGN and a few other places. And then went sideways out of that into the development side of the industry from there.
That is why you mentioned prior to this interview that you are a retro guy, because you started with the Mega Drive.
Yeah, so basically ever since then I've just either hoarded things or regretted selling things and then tried to recollect things later on. And it's been frustrating realizing over the years that I maybe have quite good taste, particularly in when I was sort of in the PS1 era as a kid. I had quite good taste apparently, but traded a lot of games in or sold games when the PS2 came out. And then going back and recollecting some stuff from that era recently has been a bit of a shock to the system, realizing, this thing that I thought was cool because I played a demo of and maybe spent £10-15 to buy, now I have to spend £100, £150 to get it again, which is the way of things. For sure, but yeah, I built up a decent collection over the years now, and we had a trip to Japan a couple of years ago that included raiding all the usual places that everybody raids when they go to Japan. So yeah, it's a growing collection for sure.
Wonderful. The Project Cars actually that we talked about today actually has a different start than most games. Actually, Project Cars, despite it's about cars, it's not really standing for cars, but for community-assisted racing simulator. And the series of Project Cars actually grew out from the community. And I wonder, how did Slightly Mad Studios one day wake up and say, we want to make a racing simulation bundle of all types of racings you can get, and take it to the community and make it community.
So it came about originally because the CEO Ian Bell kind of needed to put a new business plan together after the company had worked on some Need for Speed titles for EA, and they weren't sure what they were going to do next, basically. And it was before the days of Kickstarter even existed. I think it was 2-3 years before Kickstarter was invented as an idea. And Ian himself came up with this notion of, we have this great idea for a game that we want to do, which, as you say, covers the whole breadth of motorsport, from all the sort of big professional series that people know, and then also the history of the sport and all the junior categories that you would race in, as a young driver coming up through your career. And no one had done something like that before. So he decided to reach out to the racing game fan community and put this crowdfunding idea together. And that's where the whole idea came from. And then the name of the game as well originally came from that.
Yeah, actually, I read, as you said, that you were involved in the Need for Speed series, at least for some titles. Could you name maybe one or two that the studio was involved with?
Yeah, so the studio did Need for Speed Shift 1 and 2.
Nice. Yeah, which actually was outstanding from the series because it was more like simulation racer and was not so much arcade.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a big departure for Need for Speed, and I think it kind of at a time when really there wasn't really an in-between at that point between the kind of super serious, very niche PC sim racing titles and where Gran Turismo or Forza were at the time. There wasn't really anything in between, and I think that proved that there was more to the racing game market than hardcore, so almost sort of like a flight sim equivalent and the arcade stuff, and no one had kind of gone through the middle of that. And that period of time working on Need for Speed, I think, really proved to the industry and to people at Slightly Mad that there was this ground that could be really fruitful and could produce some really exciting new sort of kind of racing game. And then from there, it became this idea of, well, what else can we bring to that? There's a history of motorsport, all the junior categories that don't normally get featured in games as well. And that sort of became a kind of snowball effect that eventually became Project Cars.
So Slightly Mad Studios stands for Mad Gaming Ideas?
I think it was a very clear. Anybody who knows Ian in the community or has worked with him and the guys that he started the business with, it's very apt. Let's say the name for the company. The company, if it didn't have these grand, crazy ideas, wouldn't be where it is today.
Interesting. Yeah. So. Well, I mean, I played Project Cars 1 and 2, so I'm well aware that you had to really focus and get into the gameplay, as it's really a simulator, and you can't just, gas through on the maximum. You would probably slide and fall off the track. Yeah. But I didn't play the Project Cars 3 yet, but what I've read on other sources was, and even in Wikipedia, it says that Project Cars 3 is not not simulation genre, but an arcade racer genre.
So it's not really as simple as that, really, as far as a change from one completely different type of game to another. It's more that what we've noticed over the years with the first two games is that the community kind of, in the same way that I was saying before, that there wasn't really anything other than one end of the genre or the other before kind of Project Cars came along, really. I think we found with the first two games in the series that a lot of people in the community were sort of graduating from arcade games to sim racing through the games that we put out. And that wasn't necessarily something that we'd expected or intended, really, when the game started out. It was very much made with sim racing fans and the crowdfunding and all of that. So once we realized that was starting to happen, we wanted with the new game not to take away the simulation stuff. It's still a Madness Engine game. It still has the technology underpinning it and the physics, be it the physics of the cars themselves or the weather simulation or the atmospheric simulation. All that stuff's still there. It was more about bringing in new features and improving areas of the game that weren't quite doing enough for those newcomers who were graduating to sim racing. So a lot of work went into really making big improvements to the way the game plays on a normal controller on a gamepad, which is a huge improvement for this game, and then introducing these the revamped career mode, RPG style systems with experience points and stuff like that, and then car upgrades, car customization, all new multiplayer modes, just making it the game around the simulation a much better experience.
Interesting, yeah. I guess when you said you slightly modified the gameplay and the way the game acts and controls, were you aware that it could, put some people down that were expecting a pure simulation like the first two parts of the series?
We knew it was a risk, but also, those there is stuff for those people as well. You know, you don't want people to feel like they've been abandoned with their hardcore fan. You know, I personally worked quite closely with our physics team and our vehicle team when it came to improvements to like the way the steering wheels work, particularly in the force feedback area. So we really dismantled the way that we did force feedback in the previous games and looked at it piece by piece and built it back up, which was a really fun process to do, actually going through kind of, rather than just looking at the physics and the forces being delivered to the wheels, we went through the previous two games and looked very deeply at the different phases of cornering in a real car and what bits of detail were missing in the braking phase and the turning phase, and then putting the power back on and the extra detail you need when you're trying to catch a slide and that sort of thing. So the level of detail we go to and the kind of fine-tooth comb that we've always had with these games is definitely still there. I think that the sim racing community at times can be a little bit hostile to things that are designed to bring new people into the genre, and that's something that we really want to improve for our games and for the genre as a whole. Is there does need to sometimes be more acceptance of things like that, and I think anyone who played Project Cars 2 even with a gamepad compared to how it feels straight out of the box in Project Cars 3 would see such a huge improvement there. That's immediately going to make it a more welcoming place for newcomers. And if more people play racing games, particularly more simulation-style racing games, then that's going to improve the whole player base, improve the competition. Everybody has to improve their games then, and that's the sort of thing we're trying to do, is make the genre more welcoming and sort of challenge the big boys a little bit and improve that competition and make all the games better, if that makes sense.
Interesting that making it more welcoming and controllable by newcomers were a factor for making it less totally realistic and simulation-wise, but also get some arcade elements in it. Because normally, if you have the series, you would, I guess, you would try to, make people that love the other earlier part of the series feel welcome and at home, and instead saying, I take a risk and modify this a bit is quite surprising. Because, I mean, let's face it, when you play Pro Evolution Soccer or FIFA Soccer, you expect a certain type of game, and they are not redoing or fundamentally change the gameplay or the way it controls year after year. So Project Cars 1 and 2 really play similar. And then now with Project Cars 3, you kind of made a cut and changed a few things. That's interesting for me that you would go and take a risk like that.
I think if people don't take risks in a genre like this, where the games, historically they don't change a huge amount in terms of its sequels and racing games, a little bit like the sports games you were referencing. And I think we're at a stage where the genre is beginning to grow a little bit more quickly because of things that are happening in the real world of motorsport and more people getting interested in motorsport in general, and that's helping to grow sim racing. But if we don't take a few risks here and there and make sim racing itself more welcoming, then it's only ever going to sort of appeal to the same people who've been playing these games for some cases for 10, 20, even 20 years, even longer. And we do need to open it up to new people, because what we don't want to have a situation where the kind of player base gets older and older in our genre. And with the things that are happening in motorsport as well, with we've got the Formula E in the game for the first time, for example, and this trend towards electric racing and other aspects of things. If there's going to be more younger people getting interested in racing, they need to be kind of gradually able to be introduced to the genre. And you're seeing that with the games our colleagues are making over at Codemasters as well. Like they had an optional simple handling model in Formula One this year, for instance. So I think you'll see more of that in the genre going forward. I think you won't necessarily see it with some of the more kind of PC only racing sims. I think those will kind of keep doing their thing. But with multi-platform racing games like ours, particularly, I think you'll see that sort of thing happening more often.
You mentioned electronic cars, so maybe if there is Project Cars 4, we are going with e-cars instead.
Well, we have got some more electric cars in this game that we didn't have very many of at all previously. But yeah, I'd be very surprised if we go all electric, especially with our tendency to focus on the history of the sport as well. But we're not going to suddenly forget about the Le Mans cars of the 70s and 80s and things like that.
Interesting that you mentioned staying with the engine you used before, because that is also something that people were afraid about in the community, that now Codemasters is involved. You would switch to the Codemasters engine for the Project Cars 3, but you didn't actually do that. You keep using what you used before.
Yeah, there was never an intention of changing engine for this game. Obviously, the first two games were very successful and built on that technology, and we had been working on this game for quite a long time before the acquisition by Codemasters. So especially in the latter stages of development, it would have been a nightmare of biblical proportions to try and change the game engine after we'd been working on this game for over a year before we were even acquired back at the beginning of this year. So yeah, there was no intention of doing that with this game. And the Madness engine and Project Cars itself are very much products of Slightly Mad Studios, so you can expect that to continue for the foreseeable future. But at the same time, having said that, we are beginning to share technology and expertise back and forth between the two companies, which obviously would make no sense for us not to do that. And that's going to make us stronger and help us to learn things that we maybe didn't know about before, and also it'll teach them on the Codemasters side some stuff they maybe didn't think of or know already. And then even little things like our art assets and stuff like that, although we're working in different game engines, certain elements of certain tracks or cars where the licensing allows for it, there's things we could to share there to get little boosts ahead on the next games that we're both working on.
Yeah, and Codemasters doesn't have. I mean, their engine is no slouch in itself. I'm a fan of the Dirt series that they put out, and those are solid racing games. It's more the arcade style, but it's still they're well done. They're well done. So you're not. So an acquisition by Codemasters is not hurting anything. It's not gonna.
No, not at all. I think that absolutely the expertise and the knowledge. There's a lot of overlap in those areas, particularly with the areas that both companies share. So physics programmers, and not just general physics programmers in general, but they have specialists over there that focus on their tire model, and so do we. And there's overlaps in some of that existing sort of experience and knowledge, and then also there's even overlaps in data that both companies have received from car companies over the years that we may have interpreted slightly differently, but then that shared knowledge might mean that there's a better interpretation that can be done in the future by a sort of meeting of minds. So yeah, I think it's only going to benefit both sides, but I'd be surprised if we suddenly switch to their technology. I think it's going to be more a case of learning from sort of development pipelines rather than both companies converging on one engine that gets used for everything, at least for the foreseeable future.
Interesting that you mentioned in the buy sentence the licensing issue, and I mean racing series had a lot of those problems for many years. For many years there was no IndyCar series game, or there was a huge gap between one NASCAR racing game and the other NASCAR racing game. And I think even in the Formula One area, there were some years where there was no recent Formula One game after Jeff Goulmont stopped working on racing games that he actually made famous in the 90s. GP Grand Prix 1 for the Amiga PC, and then GP Grand Prix 2 that didn't even run on the fastest PC at that time fluently, because the game was so technically advanced. So that is, I think, one of the hardest issues of Project Cars, being allowed to put all those series of different car racing games in it.
I think, the part of the reason we've been able to do that really is that we haven't taken necessarily an approach so far of always approaching like a championship and trying to grab the whole championship wholesale. We found it, particularly in the world of sports car racing, there's a lot of overlap with the same cars that appear in multiple championships around the world. So the best example of that is the GT3 class, where there are national, regional, world championships all run by different organizations and different promoters. And it was easier for us to be able to replicate versions of those by licensing the cars that appear in all those championships, because in some cases it's the same team with the same car, the exact same car, not another one from a different garage based in another one part of the world, the exact same car, racing in lots of different championships around the world, sometimes in the same livery as well. So it was easier for us to go in cases like that and license the Ferrari GT3 car, the Lamborghini, the Mercedes, and get the whole series worth of cars, because we're already licensing with those brands for, you know, road cars or whatever else it might be, or some of their historic stuff. So we can bundle that stuff in and then build a sort of, with the same rules, effectively build like a facsimile of a championship without necessarily having to have the rights for a specific series. You're very much, I think, and history shows us in some of the games that have gone down this route more recently as well, you get very tied into one specific thing if you go start licensing championships wholesale. Even with Formula E, we took the approach of licensing the car rather than the full championship, just to have that flexibility of tracks and environments where that car can appear and things like that. And similar with IndyCar that we have as well. So it's been more of an approach of licensing cars for us rather than championships, and that's partly what gives us that flexibility to cover such a broad selection of different motorsport disciplines, and to go back through the historical stuff as well, which is very tricky to do if you're trying to get historical rights to championships rather than the individual cars and brands that appeared in them.
And it's also interesting that you found Namco Bandai as a publisher. I mean, Namco Bandai, I remember those names from Pac-Man and stuff, not really for a racing game series, you know?
Well, they obviously do have some racing game series. So I'm definitely a big Ridge Racer fan from back in the day, and particularly Ridge Racer Type 4 actually on the PS1. So there is some stuff there. But I think, yeah, they've kind of not always known what to do with Ridge Racer itself necessarily. And, you know, one day I'd love to see that come back. But they had a period where I think they saw this growth in simulation racing coming, and, you know, Project Cars had been, you know, the crowdfunding had been happening, and it had been getting a lot of attention, that first game, while it was in development, because of it being one of the first, what was next gen at the time, you know, the PS4 generation. It was one of the first games for that generation that was shown quite early on, you know, a year or two before those machines were coming out. And I think they saw the potential of the game and the potential of the genre, and, you know, they were eager to come on as a publisher. And, you know, those first two games have been really successful with them, and they're really easy guys to work with on the third game as well. So yeah, it's been a good match.
I mean, as I said, with the Ridge Racer series, they probably had enough experience to see the potential in Project Cars, you know. Interesting is, you mentioned in Project Cars 1 and 2 that you actually were planning to release it on Linux and on the Switch, but later on it was said by Slightly Mad Studios the Switch is not powerful enough, and I wonder if this wouldn't be a good case to prove that it is possible. Like, I mean, there were other impossible games like Doom or Wolfenstein 2 that suddenly also were, by panic button released, also, you know, scaled down in resolution and detail on the graphics. But I wonder if you are not planning to give it another try, perhaps, at some point.
Yeah, it's trickier for us, I think, than for sort of your traditional mainstream genre games. I think the kind of the depth of the simulation technology that underpins what Project Cars is, and that's, you know, everything from the cars themselves to the tire model to the weather simulation, and not just the weather in terms of the graphics, but the actual physical simulation of the atmospherics and the way that rain interacts with the track, or temperature interacts with the track, all those kinds of things. And it's not necessarily exclusive to Project Cars even, but the sim racing genre and our game are quite processor heavy. And while we know we could do what Doom did and what other games have done in terms of compromising on graphical detail and resolution, but we'd also have to compromise on physics and weather simulation and things like that. And it's sort of not being willing to compromise on areas like that that are such a core part of what the franchise is known for. That's sort of led us away from Switch for the time being. I don't think we ever want to say never, but it's a technical challenge that is. It would take us quite a while to tackle that, I think, for sure. But yeah, I wouldn't say never. But yeah, we'd have to be confident that we weren't compromising the core of what the game is, and that goes beyond just visual detail.
Good point. Good point. The weather simulation, by the way, I remember I was going crazy once, and I had like nighttime, foggy, raining. No, it was nighttime, foggy, slippery road, and snowfall.
Jeez.
Was like, oh my god, you can get it all. And I couldn't really drive a meter without getting off the track. I was like, oh my god, you can really get crazy with the weather simulation and settings in those games. And I guess you kept that for Project Cars 3.
Yeah, absolutely. We can't do away with things like that, having spent so much time developing these systems. And the way that the weather interacts with the weather preceding it or the weather after it, if it's changeable, and just the general level of challenge, be it the challenge of driving behind someone in the spray or dealing with the low grip levels in the snow and things. It's something that we're very proud of, and it's kind of a core tenet of the franchise. So yeah, that's not going away in this game or anything else that we do anytime soon.
I wonder when you prepare for such games, do you go to lengths and go to the real locations like for example football games do, and measuring the location and the track and doing tons of photos and analyzing the physical aspect of the cars and how the weather is influencing it?
It depends
that kind of
on
stuff you did?
Yeah, it depends on the car and it depends on the track. So the majority of the tracks these days we get sort of surface scan data, sometimes from a kind of third-party company that specializes in visiting all the tracks and collating that. Sometimes the tracks own the data themselves and we get a track. Sometimes we have to go and create that data ourselves. And it's a combination sometimes, and it varies from track to track. But some tracks, it's basically a truck that drives around and shoots lasers in every direction, scans the surfaces, and we build the tracks from that data. Sometimes it's that with a combination of drones being flown over tracks and grabbing photogrammetry and things like that. But yeah, it varies from circuit to circuit, but it's almost all the tracks in the game now are data-driven rather than photo reference-driven. And then the cars is a similar situation. So almost all the modern cars are obviously developed with computer-aided design these days rather than somebody starting out with pen and paper. So more often than not, we get access to that data, which is usually way too detailed for any game engine. The number of polygons is ridiculous. It's the same data that factories use to actually start building the cars. So it's massively detailed. And we have to kind of optimize that for the game engine, but the cars often, almost always modern cars, start from that kind of computer data. And then the car brands or the race teams will always provide us, along with that, with physical data for the cars in terms of performance data, telemetry data from a selection of circuits, and driver input data sometimes as well. And that all gets built into the game engine. And then the final step usually is meeting with some of the real drivers who've driven those cars, whether they're modern or historic. Sometimes it's retired drivers even for historic cars, and getting those guys to drive the game and understand whether that initial raw data feels close to the real thing, whether it needs to be tweaked, that kind of thing. So I've been there for some of those days in person, which are always really fascinating. Those have been really fun to be a part of over the years. And then the actual development of the historic cars is usually quite different because obviously they're for most cars sort of probably from the early 80s back, there isn't the computer data. So that usually involves a combination of extensive photo reference and visiting a car in order to take a handheld scanner and scan that into the computer. And sometimes that's a case where we get to go and visit a car company's sort of in-house archive. So a lot of car companies these days have museums, and if the cars are in museums, we can go and scan them. But some of them have these super secret underground bunkers, basically full of old race cars
Wow.
they won't even that maybe they're one of a kind, and they won't even risk putting them in a museum because it's the only example left. Some race car companies, particularly in the 60s even, were like scrapping the cars after they stopped racing them because they thought no one would ever care, and they might only have one left or whatever, and getting access to those is tricky. And then sometimes it's even private collectors who have the car companies may not have archived some of their older stuff at all, and it's just in the hands of private collectors. So often we have to go and find those guys and get their individual permission to go and scan their cars. But sometimes we also have to get the private collectors vetted by the car companies themselves, and whether they trust that guy to actually have it up to what was really the factory spec or not. So it's this whole minefield of stuff. But yeah, it's really exciting to be a part of those processes sometimes, and sometimes get to go see those cars in person. And sometimes that might be static, but maybe I get to occasionally go and on the days where we're also doing audio recordings and see those cars run. And some guys in the dev team will get to do ride-alongs so they can get a feel for what it's like inside the car while it's being driven. It's really exciting, all that process.
Wow, when I asked this question, I had no idea that the answer would be so complex and detailed. Yeah. amazing. I'm coming from a time where I played test drive in the 80s, and I was happy enough if the inside of the car looked different, and there was no different sound and so on. And now you say that even the developers go and drive the car and making sound recordings to make sure that everything is correct and feels right in the game. So I wonder, as I said, sometimes you work with professional drivers and getting their opinion. What is the perspective? What is the kind of feedback you are getting? I mean, I know as a kid of the 90s, people had the perspective that this was a waste of time and basically toys to waste time. But I guess nowadays
I think we could tell by his answer earlier that this entire game is mostly just a ploy for the developers to go and play with cool cars.
They call it Slightly Mad for a reason, yeah. It's been a kind of, the real world drivers is interesting because you have to kind of go in with an under and try and figure out what that individual's understanding of simulation is as well. Like the feedback is only as good as the individual driver's understanding of simulation. So with some of the guys who are maybe retired and did historic racing, we have to kind of plug them into the sim world a little bit first to make that feedback valuable. And in a lot of cases, that led to us working with, when we did, a good example is when we did all the Porsche testing with one of their real-world drivers for Project Cars 2. We ended up using a guy called Patrick Long, who's a US-based Porsche driver who races their cars in current modern championships. But he's also a sort of historian of Porsche himself and owns a bunch of old Porsche race cars that he takes out for fun. So he had that modern kind of driver experience of working with simulators as part of his preparation for racing modern cars for real, and had the experience of racing the historic stuff that he owned personally. So that was a really good balance. But yeah, we had all sorts of weird and interesting experiences working with the real drivers. One of my favourite ones was that there was one when we were working with McLaren a few years ago where we were doing their GT3 race car at the time, and the test driver said that the car felt very like a real GT3 car, but a bad one, and he couldn't figure out why. And it turned out that one of the information sheets that McLaren gave to us had the values for the suspension backwards, like they had the rear suspension values in the front suspension and the front suspension values in the rear. And as soon as we swapped that around, he was like, okay, it's fine now, that feels really good. So we have these experiences sometimes where it's only as good as the data we're given and the feedback we're given, and sometimes we're looking for little little errors in there or little mistakes, and sometimes it's super obvious, and sometimes it's more about gradual feedback and a gradual process of finding those little things that need fixing or tweaking. That same test with McLaren, actually, we were working with Pirelli tyre engineers, which is very rare, like the hardest companies to get data out of for consumer simulation technology as the tire companies. They're very secretive about how race tires work. And we had our kind of tire physics programmer sat with his laptop with this Pirelli race engineer sat next to him, and they basically were tweaking values until both of their graphs overlaid on top of each other lined up perfectly. And the joy on our programmer's face when that finally happened was really exciting as well. And yeah, all those kinds of experiences are, it's the sort of things that happen in real world motorsport or in real world car development over a long period of time. We have car companies who will say to us, "Oh, we spent 6 months going to test tracks, developing this prototype of a road car, even over this long period of time, and they've sat with us and done the same kind of process in the digital world over a few days or even a few hours in some cases, but doing the same kind of back-to-back A to B testing." And for them, it's really fascinating. As fascinating as it is for us to get that insight into the real world, they're kind of fascinated by our simulation world as well.
I mean, nowadays you have the advantage that if you make a mistake with the engine behavior, as I just said before, you can just apply an update. It plays in over Steam, and the problem is fixed. But back then in the 80s and 90s, if you had a major bug in the game, it stayed there. I mean, nowadays you have it. You have really those things to your advantage. I wonder, because you mentioned at the beginning in your introduction that you are a collector yourself, and I found no information Googling around. How about the physical release of the PC version? I mean, I found pictures, mock-ups that says PC DVD, but everywhere I look, I only find the download version.
Sure, we don't actually have any plans at the moment for a physical PC release of the game. As you said, though, I'm being a collector myself. I understand that frustration that sometimes happens with the modern age of digital games. If we can, we'd love to do it if we can do it. The scope isn't there right now, particularly with this year being a weird one in terms of the challenges that come with physical games in general. So it's definitely a year where we are leaning more towards digital. But yeah, if it's possible in the future, we'll look at it. But there aren't any specific plans for it at the moment.
Okay. So those mock-ups are really just mock-ups because they just had this PC DVD laying around and put it on the picture.
Yeah, I think though in cases where these like the kind of 3D box mock-ups and stuff, stuff we have to do for retailers and stuff.
Interesting. Despite it's download only, on many pictures it still says PC DVD. I mean the data amount probably would fit. It's just as I said, mock-up for the retailers. It's interesting, as I said. It is because of this special year, so I guess the planning just didn't come through. I mean, there are alternatives. I mean, for example, when Need for Speed Payback was released in 2017, they actually decided to make the physical release just a steel box, where you could burn your DVD with the installer and put it inside the steel box. But for me, that's not really a physical release. But that is something a lot of publishers are doing right now. Yeah. Well, I mean, there are some exceptions. For example, Flight Simulator 2020 was released on 10 DVDs.
Yeah, maybe not the most environmentally friendly way of releasing a game in the current era.
and I thought, like, when GTA 5 was released 5 years ago, I thought like, wow, 5 DVDs, that's a big game. And then came Microsoft with Flight Simulator 2020, like we can top that. Yeah, of course, I see. Well, the reasoning Microsoft put was there are still areas in the world where there is slow internet, and they at least have 90 gigabytes of data, which I think probably with Project Cars 3, you don't have as much data to download.
Yeah, I think the flight sim thing is interesting actually, because it's probably, if you look at the genre over the last, God knows how long, since they've existed basically, since the 80s, since flight simulators came around, it's tended to be an older demographic. So I wonder as well if Microsoft were there were maybe thinking kind of, we need to be in the places where those people are likely to buy software, and they may not necessarily go to Steam or the Windows Store or whatever. So that may be an element of that there as well. Although that game does still, I think it still has a huge patch, doesn't it? Anyway, even if you have all the discs. So.
Yeah. It allows pre-installing from the DVDs that takes like 5 hours, and then you still have 30 gigabytes to download afterwards.
Yeah. So it's sort of like a worse version of buying LA Noire for the Switch or something.
yeah, kind of, yeah. Well, I mean, as you mentioned it, the COVID situation and the physical market, I mean, that is why I really like the Switch, because it still has game cards, physical medias, That's basically my thing. And I mean, they had games before that had to be partly downloaded, but then Nintendo offered like game cards that were twice as big in memory suddenly. Now this problem is solved. So let's see how the situation changes next year, and see if perhaps we can see Project Cars 4 if the mixed feedback from the community right now and from the press isn't slowing you down and saying, okay, we will not do a Project Cars 4, because that is what often happens in series. Once there is a mixed reviewed part, often game series are discontinued. And I mean, famous example would be Command and Conquer, where the last part had so bad reviews that they said like, okay, we are not doing it anymore.
Well, that's for bad reviews. I mean, mixed reviews generally you would. I think mixed reviews you often do a sequel. You just kind of go back to what works.
That's a question.
I was just going to say, we've got actually quite a long tail of support plan for this game, at least a year or so. So, and one of the things we did with this game that we hadn't done before was we put a lot more kind of analytics information into the game. So we're learning very quickly about how people are playing it, which we haven't necessarily been able to do in the same way in the past. We've got much more sophisticated at that, and also just in terms of we know a lot, as you can imagine from the crowdfunding background. We're very in tune with our fan base, and in terms of not just reading the things that they comment on themselves, but just gathering feedback generally and actually talking to them. We have a really good Discord that people can jump into and ask questions directly to the dev team as well, which is really cool. So yeah, we're learning all the time about all that sort of stuff, and that'll be reflected in the updates and in the extra content that will be coming for the game over the next, at least sort of next year or so.
Then you should send us an invite to the Discord, because I'm not inside that Discord yet. Maybe I should
play the game first, and then you'll have the questions.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, well, I mean, it came out of surprise. Suddenly, the interview came faster than I expected. You were like, "Yeah, next Monday is good." So that was pretty quick then. Well, so I would say it's good to know that you said you took the risk and changed a bit of the gameplay and try to analyze how to improve Project Cars 4. I mean, perhaps the solution is to make switchable modes between more arcadey and more simulation. I mean, that is what some games did, that allowed switching between the two. But of course, I'm not an expert in simulation games. I don't know if this is a good idea even to make 2 game modes for one game.
Sure. I mean, as I say, we've got lots to learn from the community over the next year or so supporting this game. So we're a little ways away from thinking about what sort of form Project Cars 4 will take. But yeah, what you just mentioned, the guys at Codemasters have sort of done a version of that with Formula One this year with a sort of, I can't remember exactly what it's called, but sort of accessible handling model that's optional within that game. So it's one of the many areas where not just what we learn from our fans about our own game, but being part of Codemasters now, I'm sure, depending on what information they learn from their fan base about that might be something we can learn about for the future as well. But yeah, at the moment we're a ways away from Project Cars 4 for sure. We're definitely in the it's kind of post-release support window that will go on for a good while for Project Cars 3 first.
What is the feature that you are proud of in Project Cars 3 that nobody talked about in all those reviews and comments?
There's for me personally, there's two things that really jump out. One is there's this thing called I'm forgetting the name of it. This thing called corner markers, which is basically I think something we introduced to replace the kind of racing line assist that's become quite traditional over the years in terms of the effectively a painted line on the ground that changes colour to tell you when to brake and things. I think we really noticed in the way we play racing games as people who are really into them, and then watching the community and streams and YouTube videos and stuff, that the people who use that racing line feature a lot in our games and in other games, they really over rely on it, and it stops becoming a learning tool and just becomes a bit of a crutch. Basically, it becomes this kind of almost like a note highway in a rhythm game, like a Rock Band or a Guitar Hero, where you're really just watching that and not really participating in the simulation, as it were. Mm-hmm. And the thing that they do in the real world, in kind of race school environments and track days, is that they have cones positioned around the outside edge of the track. So they'll have one on the outside edge on the way towards the corner as this is a suggested braking point. One on the inside of the corner at the apex, where this is where you should be aiming the car for on turn in. And then one on the exit, which is on the outside again, and where you should aim the car towards on the exit. And that stuff's there to build muscle memory for. So if you eventually become an actual racing driver and those cones are taken away from you, you've built some muscle memory up for the car you're driving and for the circuit. So we kind of adapted that into the game world with the corner marker assist, which replaces the racing line. And that's similar markers that appear in the HUD rather than physically on the circuit, and they mark the same things: braking point, apex point, an exit point. But being a video game, we can adjust that stuff dynamically. So depending on the circuit, which car you're driving, what upgrades you've applied to your car as well. And that's a really good tool for building the muscle memory of that skill of driving racing lines and learning braking points. And it means that when you turn that off, you're still sort of in tune with the car and the track that you've been driving, and you're not necessarily going from this thing that you stare at and rely on to not having anything at all and having to start over again and basically relearn everything without it. Instead of that, it helps you build the muscle memory, which is really cool. And we encourage players to eventually turn it off by giving them bigger XP point rewards at the end of races if they're not using it. So that's been really cool. And then also just the matchmaking side of the game. Like we've had in Project Cars 2, we had a racing license system for the online multiplayer that measured your skill and your pace, and also sort of how safely you raced and how fairly you raced. But it existed as numbers in your profile, but didn't really get used really in the multiplayer side of the game. We had all that information about all the players, but didn't do a lot with it. So this time we've refined the way those calculations are made, but also introduced sort of full skill-based matchmaking. So whenever you're hitting and jumping into modes like quick race or the scheduled events that take place at certain times of each day, you're being matched properly against people who are similar, not just similar ability to you, but similar sort of sportsmanship to you in terms of how they drive as well. So the races are going to get fairer and more competitive for you the more often you play. And then that feeds into the competitive side of the game and the eSports scene and that kind of thing as well, which we're super proud of, especially at the grassroots level. Our ability to find new talent that's coming up through sim racing and help them to win some competitions and progress and make a name for themselves is something we've had a good track record of with this franchise. And yeah, hopefully that's going to carry on too.
Great. Well, so from my side, I think we got it covered.
Yeah, awesome. Where do people go to find out about this and to get the game and everything?
Just hit up projectcarsgame.com for sure, or just follow any of the Project Cars Game channels on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You'll find links to the Discord I mentioned over there as well. So if you want to get more deeply involved and start chatting with the community, join some leagues, chat to the dev team, you can do that there as well.
Awesome.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, cheers, guys. Have a good night.
Yes, you too.
Yep,
See you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for sitting with us.
Yeah, thanks again for having me. Cheers.
No problem.